Thomas Miller wiped the sweat from his weathered forehead as he watched the sun rise over his family's 200-acre farm in rural Kentucky. At 52 years old, he had spent every morning of the last 30 years the same way, checking on his cattle, inspecting his crops, and breathing in the fresh country air that his grandfather had taught him to appreciate. The land had been in the Miller family for over a century, passed down from father to son like a sacred trust. But today felt different. Today, Thomas carried a certified letter in his shirt pocket that had arrived 3 days ago, a letter that made his stomach churn every time he thought about it. The envelope bore the logo of Morrison Development Corporation, and inside was a message that threatened to destroy everything he had ever known. The letter was from Catherine Morrison, the 38-year-old CEO of one of the fastest-growing real estate development companies in the region. She was known throughout the business world as a ruthless negotiator who turned small towns into profitable commercial districts. Her company had already transformed 3 neighboring counties, buying up farmland and replacing rolling pastures with shopping centers, apartment complexes, and strip malls. Catherine had never set foot on a working farm, but she could read property values and market trends better than most people could read a newspaper. She had grown up in downtown Louisville, attended Harvard Business School, and built her empire by understanding one simple truth. Rural land was cheap to buy and expensive to develop. The Miller farm sat directly in the path of her latest project, a massive mixed-use development that would bring thousands of new residents to the area. The letter was brief but devastating. Morrison Development Corporation had made an offer to purchase the Miller farm for $2.3 million, which was actually above market value for agricultural land. But the offer came with a non-negotiable condition that made Thomas's blood run cold. He had exactly 90 days to accept the deal and vacate the property. If he refused, Catherine had made it clear that she would use every legal tool at her disposal to force the sale through eminent domain proceedings. Thomas had spent the last 3 nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling of the old farmhouse where he had been born. His wife Sarah had passed away 2 years earlier from cancer, and his only son Michael lived in Seattle, working as a software engineer with no interest in farming. The land that had once seemed like an eternal legacy now felt like a burden that no one else wanted to carry. But it was more than just land to Thomas. Every fence post had been set by his hands or his father's hands. Every field held memories of successful harvests and difficult seasons. The old oak tree by the pond was where he had proposed to Sarah 43 years ago. The barn had sheltered 5 generations of Miller family livestock. This wasn't just property to be bought and sold, it was his entire identity. Catherine Morrison saw things very differently. She lived in a sleek downtown penthouse apartment, drove a BMW, and measured success in quarterly profit reports. She had studied the Miller property from aerial surveys and tax records, but she had never walked its boundaries or understood its history. To her, it was simply 200 acres of underutilized land sitting in the perfect location for her newest development. The business case was compelling. The land sat adjacent to a new highway interchange that would be completed within 18 months. Market research showed growing demand for suburban housing as young families moved out of Louisville looking for affordable homes with good schools. The Miller farm could accommodate nearly 400 single-family homes, a small shopping center, and an elementary school. Conservative estimates projected over $50 million in total development value. Catherine had built her career on making these kinds of deals happen quickly and efficiently. She understood that farmers like Thomas Miller often had emotional attachments to their land that had nothing to do with financial reality. Her strategy was always the same: make a generous offer with a firm deadline, then apply legal pressure if necessary. Most property owners eventually accepted that fighting a well-funded corporation was futile. Thomas knew he was in an impossible situation. Even if he could afford the legal fees to fight Morrison Development Corporation, Kentucky's eminent domain laws heavily favored development projects that promised economic growth and increased tax revenue. The county commissioners were already excited about the jobs and tax revenue that Catherine's project would bring to the area. But there was something else in Catherine's letter that troubled Thomas even more than the legal threats. She had done her homework on his personal situation. The letter mentioned his wife's medical bills, his son's lack of interest in farming, and the declining profitability of small-scale agriculture in the region. Catherine had presented the sale not as a hostile takeover, but as a practical solution to his problems. The most painful part was that some of what she wrote was true. The farm had been struggling financially since Sarah's illness. Medical bills had eaten up most of their savings, and crop yields had been poor for the last 2 seasons, due to unusual weather patterns. At his age, Thomas knew he was facing the reality that he might not be able to work the land much longer anyway. As Thomas fed his cattle that morning, he tried to imagine the land covered with houses and parking lots. He pictured families moving into cookie-cutter homes where his corn had grown, children playing in yards where his grandfather had once plowed with horses. Part of him understood that development brought opportunities for jobs and economic growth, but another part of him felt like he was being asked to participate in the destruction of something irreplaceable. The 90-day deadline gave him exactly 12 weeks to make the most important decision of his life. 12 weeks to choose between fighting for his family's legacy and accepting the reality of modern economic development. 12 weeks to decide whether he was a stubborn old farmer clinging to the past or a wise man who knew when to let go. Catherine Morrison had given him what she called a generous window to consider her offer. But Thomas understood the implicit threat. 90 days was not really time to consider. It was time to prepare for the inevitable. She had the resources, the legal team, and the political connections to get what she wanted. The only question was whether Thomas would cooperate willingly or be forced to surrender his land through the courts. As he walked back to the farmhouse that morning, Thomas pulled the letter from his pocket one more time. The corporate letterhead seemed to mock him with its polished professionalism. Catherine Morrison's signature was bold and confident, the signature of someone who was used to getting her way. But Thomas Miller had spent his entire life working land that didn't always cooperate, raising crops that sometimes failed, and dealing with problems that couldn't be solved with money or lawyers. The deadline was real, and it was serious. But Thomas had 90 days to figure out if there was any way to fight back against a force that seemed as unstoppable as the changing seasons themselves. 6 weeks into the deadline, Thomas Miller found himself sitting across from Catherine Morrison for the first time in the conference room of Morrison Development Corporation. The meeting had been Catherine's idea, presented as a friendly discussion to address any concerns Thomas might have about the offer. But as Thomas looked around the glass-walled office 30 floors above downtown Louisville, he felt like a fish out of water. Catherine was younger than he had expected, with sharp business attire and an intensity in her dark eyes that reminded him of a hawk circling prey. She had prepared a presentation complete with architectural renderings, economic impact studies, and demographic projections. The proposed development had a name, Meadowbrook Commons, and a marketing slogan, "Where country living meets modern convenience." "Mr. Miller," Catherine began, her voice professional but not unkind. "I want you to understand that this project represents a significant investment in your community. We're talking about bringing 1,200 new residents to the area, which means new customers for local businesses, new students for the schools, and nearly $15 million in annual tax revenue." Thomas studied the architectural renderings spread across the polished conference table. The drawings showed neat rows of colonial-style homes with small yards, a shopping plaza with chain restaurants and retail stores, and wide streets with decorative streetlights. It all looked pleasant enough, but it bore no resemblance to the rolling pastures and wooded hills that had defined his family's land for generations. "What about the creek that runs through the property?" Thomas asked quietly. "And the old-growth forest on the eastern boundary?" Catherine flipped through her documents and pulled out an environmental impact assessment. "The creek will be incorporated into our stormwater management system, with decorative bridges and walking paths. As for the trees, we'll be preserving approximately 15% of the existing canopy and adding new landscaping throughout the development." Thomas felt a knot form in his stomach. The creek where he had caught his first fish at age 7 would become part of a stormwater management system. The forest where 5 generations of Miller children had built tree houses and learned to hunt would be reduced to a few scattered decorative patches. But Catherine wasn't finished. She pulled out a financial analysis that showed the declining profitability of small farms in the region over the past decade. She had charts demonstrating how agricultural land values were stagnating, while residential development was driving property values up throughout the county. I understand this is emotional for you, Catherine said, her tone softening slightly. But I also understand that you're facing some real financial challenges. Your property taxes alone are going to increase by 18% next year due to the new school bond issue. Can your current farming operation handle that kind of increased overhead? Thomas had to admit she was right about the financial pressure. He had been struggling to make ends meet even before Sarah's medical bills, and farming had become increasingly difficult for operations his size. The large corporate farms could achieve economies of scale that made small family operations nearly obsolete. There's something else you should know, Catherine continued, sliding a thick folder across the table. 3 other properties in your area have already agreed to sell. The Henderson farm to your north, the Walsh property to your west, and the old Davidson place across the county road. This development is going to happen, Mr. Miller, with or without your cooperation. Thomas opened the folder and felt his heart sink. The documents showed that his neighbors had indeed signed preliminary agreements with Morrison Development Corporation. Properties that had been farmed for generations were now marked as acquired in neat red ink on Catherine's development map. His land was beginning to look like a small island, surrounded by an inevitable tide of development. Catherine must have seen the defeat in his eyes, because her demeanor shifted from businesslike to almost sympathetic. I know this isn't easy, she said, but holding out won't stop the project, and it won't save the farming way of life in this area. What it will do is force us to pursue eminent domain proceedings, which will be expensive and stressful for everyone involved. She opened her laptop and showed him a presentation about eminent domain law in Kentucky. The slides explained how local governments could condemn private property for economic development if it served the greater public good. Catherine's company had already received preliminary approval from the County Planning Commission, and the project had strong support from the mayor and city council. The legal process typically takes 12 to 18 months, Catherine explained. During that time, your property will be tied up in litigation. You won't be able to sell to anyone else. You won't be able to make major improvements. And you'll be spending thousands of dollars on legal fees. At the end of it all, a court will determine the fair market value of your land, which will likely be less than what I'm offering you today. Thomas felt trapped. The woman sitting across from him spoke about his family's legacy as if it were just another business transaction to be processed efficiently. But she wasn't wrong about the legal realities. He had already spoken to 2 lawyers about his options, and both had told him essentially the same thing Catherine was telling him now. I have 44 days left on your deadline, Thomas said finally. What happens if I need more time to decide? Catherine's expression hardened slightly. Mr. Miller, I've been more than generous with the timeline. Most developers would have filed eminent domain paperwork already, rather than wait 3 months for an answer. Every day we delay costs my company money in financing, permits, and construction scheduling. The deadline is firm. As Thomas drove his old pickup truck back to the farm that afternoon, he tried to process everything he had learned. Catherine Morrison was not the heartless villain he had imagined. She was a businesswoman operating within a system that valued development and growth over agricultural preservation. She had been courteous, even sympathetic, but also absolutely clear about her intentions. The next few weeks became a blur of difficult conversations and sleepless nights. Thomas called his son Michael in Seattle to discuss the situation. Michael was supportive but honest. He had no intention of giving up his career in technology to become a farmer, and he understood his father's financial struggles better than Thomas had realized. Dad, Michael said during one late-night phone call, maybe it's time to think about what you want the next chapter of your life to look like. You're 52 years old. You could take that money and buy a smaller place somewhere else, maybe closer to town. You could travel, or start a different kind of business. Thomas knew his son meant well, but Michael had never understood the deep connection between the Miller family and their land. To Michael, the farm was just an asset to be managed. To Thomas, it was his identity, his purpose, and his responsibility to future generations. With 3 weeks left on the deadline, Thomas received an unexpected visitor. Catherine Morrison drove up his gravel driveway in her BMW, looking completely out of place against the backdrop of his weathered barn and rusty farm equipment. She had come alone, without lawyers or assistants. And she asked if they could walk the property together. For the first time, Catherine saw the Miller farm through Thomas's eyes. She watched him point out the fence posts he had repaired the previous spring, the pasture where his prize bull had grazed, and the spot where his grandfather's original farmhouse had stood before being replaced by the current structure in the 1,950 seconds. "My great-grandfather cleared this land with axes and mules," Thomas told her as they stood in the middle of what would become the shopping center. "During the Depression, this farm fed not just our family but half the families in the county. My father planted those oak trees along the fence line when I was born." Catherine found herself genuinely moved by Thomas's obvious love for the land, but she also saw the signs of decline that he seemed to ignore. Fences needed repair, equipment was old and worn, and several outbuildings were in obvious disrepair. The property taxes alone were eating up most of his income from the small herd of cattle he still maintained. "I can see why this place means so much to you," Catherine said as they walked back toward the farmhouse. "But I can also see that maintaining it is becoming impossible. What if we could find a way to preserve some of the land while still moving forward with development?" Catherine proposed a compromise. Morrison Development Corporation would purchase 150 acres for the main residential development, but would leave 50 acres around the original farmhouse for Thomas to keep. The company would pay fair market value for the 150 acres and help Thomas subdivide the remaining land so he could live there permanently or sell it separately if he chose. Thomas was intrigued but skeptical. "Why would you do that?" he asked. "You could just wait for the eminent domain process and get it all." Catherine surprised herself with her honesty. "Because walking your land with you today reminded me that some things have value beyond what shows up in a financial analysis. Maybe we can find a way to honor your family's history while still creating opportunities for new families to build their futures here." As Catherine drove back to Louisville that evening, she found herself questioning her usual approach to land acquisition. She had built her career on efficiency and decisive action, but something about Thomas Miller's quiet dignity and obvious love for his land had affected her in a way she hadn't expected. With 18 days left on the deadline, Thomas faced the most difficult decision of his life. The compromise offer was generous and would solve his immediate financial problems while allowing him to stay on part of the family land. But it would also mean watching his crops and pastures disappear under houses and parking lots. He spent long hours sitting under the old oak tree by the pond, trying to imagine what his grandfather would have done in the same situation. The world had changed dramatically since the days when small family farms were the backbone of rural communities. Maybe trying to preserve a way of life that was already disappearing was just stubborn pride. But as Thomas watched the sunrise over his fields each morning, he couldn't shake the feeling that some things were worth fighting for. Even when the odds were stacked against you, the deadline was approaching fast, and whatever decision he made would change his life forever. On the morning of the 89th day, Thomas Miller made a decision that would shock everyone, including himself. Instead of calling Catherine Morrison's office to accept or reject her offer, he drove his old pickup truck into town and parked outside the office of the local newspaper, the County Herald. Thomas had never spoken to a reporter in his life, but he had a story to tell. And he finally understood that sometimes the most important battles are fought not in courtrooms or boardrooms, but in the court of public opinion. The reporter, a young woman named Jessica Chen who had recently graduated from journalism school, was initially skeptical when this weathered farmer walked into her office claiming to have a story about corporate land development. But as Thomas began to speak, Jessica realized she was hearing something much more compelling than a simple property dispute. Thomas told Jessica about the generations of Miller family history tied to the land, but he also spoke honestly about the financial pressures facing small farmers and the difficult reality of trying to preserve agricultural land in a rapidly developing region. He explained Catherine Morrison's offers, both the original ultimatum and the later compromise proposal. But then Thomas said something that changed everything. "I've decided to donate my land to the county for a permanent agricultural preserve," Thomas announced quietly. "The entire 200 acres will be protected from development forever, and the county can use it for educational programs about farming and conservation. I won't make any money from this decision, but I'll know that my family's legacy will continue to serve the community for generations to come." Jessica's eyes widened. "Mr. Miller, That's a very generous decision, but how will you support yourself? And what about your property taxes and living expenses? Thomas smiled for the first time in weeks. That's where the story gets interesting. I've been working with the State Agricultural Extension Office and discovered that there are federal and state programs that provide tax incentives and even direct payments to landowners who preserve farmland for educational purposes. Between those programs and the small organic farming operation I'm planning to start, I think I can make it work. But Thomas had one more surprise. I've also invited Miss Morrison to partner with me on something completely different. Instead of houses and shopping centers, what if we created the region's first agritourism destination? Families from Louisville could come here to learn about farming. Kids could participate in educational programs, and we could demonstrate that rural land can contribute to economic development without being destroyed in the process. Jessica Chen's article appeared in the County Herald 3 days later, but it didn't stay local for long. The story of a farmer choosing to preserve his family's legacy rather than profit from development was picked up by regional newspapers, then by state media, and finally by national news outlets. Within a week, Thomas Miller had received calls from agricultural organizations, environmental groups, and even a documentary filmmaker. Catherine Morrison read the newspaper article in her downtown office and felt emotions she hadn't experienced since college. Part of her was angry that Thomas had bypassed their negotiations and taken his case to the media, but a larger part of her was impressed by his creativity and courage in finding a third option that no one else had considered. The media attention brought unexpected pressure on Morrison Development Corporation. Environmental groups organized protests outside their offices. The mayor, who had originally supported the Meadowbrook Commons project, began receiving calls from constituents who wanted to preserve the Miller farm as a symbol of the county's agricultural heritage. More importantly for Catherine's business, several major investors began questioning whether the negative publicity surrounding the Miller farm might hurt the marketability of the residential development. Corporate responsibility was becoming increasingly important to institutional investors, and forcing a family farmer off his ancestral land was not the kind of story that helped attract socially conscious capital. Catherine found herself in an unfamiliar position. For the first time in her career, she was facing a situation where the smart business decision wasn't obvious. She could still pursue eminent domain proceedings, but the legal battle would now be fought in the glare of media attention, with Thomas positioned as the sympathetic underdog fighting to preserve his family's legacy. 3 days after the newspaper article appeared, Catherine drove back to the Miller farm. This time, she came with a proposal that surprised even herself. "I've been thinking about your agritourism idea," she told Thomas as they sat on his front porch. "What if Morrison Development Corporation became your partner in creating something completely new? We have the capital and expertise to build visitor centers, educational facilities, and infrastructure. You have the land and the agricultural knowledge. Together, we could create a destination that attracts families from across the region." Thomas studied Catherine's face carefully. "What's in it for your company? This doesn't sound like your usual profit-driven development project." Catherine smiled slightly. "Honestly, it's not. But walking your land with you a few weeks ago changed how I think about development. Maybe there's a way to create economic value without destroying everything that came before. Maybe preservation and development don't have to be enemies." She pulled out a folder containing preliminary financial projections. A well-designed agritourism operation could generate significant revenue from admission fees, educational programs, event hosting, and agricultural sales. The capital investment would be lower than residential development, but the long-term returns could be comparable, especially if we can attract visitors from Louisville and surrounding metropolitan areas. Thomas was intrigued but cautious. "And what about your other projects? Your investors?" "This seems like a pretty dramatic change in business strategy." Catherine nodded thoughtfully. "You're right, it is a change. But sometimes external pressure forces you to examine whether your current approach is really the best one. This media attention has made me realize that there might be better ways to create value than simply covering rural land with houses and shopping centers." Over the next several weeks, Catherine found herself spending more time on the Miller farm than in her downtown office. She worked with Thomas to develop a comprehensive business plan for the agritourism operation. They envisioned educational programs for school groups, weekend workshops for families interested in sustainable agriculture, seasonal festivals celebrating local food and farming traditions, and even corporate retreat programs for businesses wanting to give their employees authentic rural experiences. The transformation was remarkable to watch. Catherine, who had built her career on efficiency and decisive action, discovered she enjoyed the slower pace of agricultural planning. She learned about crop rotation, sustainable farming practices, and the complex relationships between soil health, weather patterns, and successful harvests. Thomas, meanwhile, found himself energized by the possibility of sharing his agricultural knowledge with a new generation of visitors. The prospect of teaching children about farming and connecting urban families with rural traditions gave him a sense of purpose that had been missing since his wife's death. 6 months later, the Miller Farm Educational Center held its grand opening. Catherine's development company had invested $1.8 million in visitor facilities, educational buildings, and infrastructure improvements. Thomas had used federal agricultural preservation grants to restore the original farmhouse and create demonstration gardens showcasing heritage vegetables and sustainable farming techniques. The opening day attracted over 800 visitors, including the mayor, several county commissioners, and a delegation from the state agricultural department. Local television stations covered the event, and the governor issued a proclamation recognizing the Miller Farm as a model for agricultural preservation and rural economic development. But the most meaningful moment for Thomas came when his son Michael arrived from Seattle with his wife and 2 young children. Thomas watched his grandchildren collect eggs from the henhouse, pet the gentle dairy cows, and learn to identify different types of crops growing in the demonstration fields. "Dad," Michael said as they stood together watching the children explore the farm, "I never understood why this place meant so much to you until I saw my kids experience it today. Thank you for finding a way to preserve it." Catherine's business model proved successful beyond anyone's expectations. Within the first year, the Miller Farm Educational Center attracted over 15,000 visitors and generated enough revenue to be financially self-sustaining. More importantly, it had created a new model for rural development that other communities began to adopt. The success led to unexpected opportunities for Catherine's company. Morrison Development Corporation began specializing in sustainable rural projects that combined preservation with economic development. The company's reputation for environmental responsibility attracted new investors and opened doors to consulting opportunities with other developers facing similar community preservation challenges. For Catherine personally, the project represented a fundamental shift in how she understood success and value creation. She had started her career measuring achievement purely in financial terms, but working with Thomas had taught her that some of the most important value couldn't be captured in quarterly profit reports. Thomas, meanwhile, had discovered that preserving his family's legacy didn't require him to freeze the land in time like a museum exhibit. By sharing the farm with thousands of visitors each year, he had found a way to keep agricultural traditions alive while adapting to the economic realities of the modern world. The old oak tree by the pond, where Thomas had once sat alone wondering how to save his family's farm, now provided shade for picnic tables where families gathered to eat lunch, and children played, while their parents attended workshops on sustainable gardening. The creek that Catherine had once planned to incorporate into a stormwater management system now served as an outdoor classroom where visitors learned about water conservation and aquatic ecology. On quiet mornings before the educational center opened to visitors, Thomas still walked the same boundaries his grandfather had shown him 60 years earlier, but now he walked them with a sense of hope and purpose that he hadn't felt since before his wife's illness. The land that had once seemed like a burden he couldn't afford to maintain had become a bridge connecting past and future, rural and urban, preservation and progress. The deadly deadline that had once threatened to destroy Thomas Miller's world had instead opened it up to possibilities he never could have imagined. Sometimes the end of one story is really just the beginning of another.